Okay, so here's what we have. You've got a nice shirt. So this will be our first segment for questions for Pastor. And our first question, they asked to remain anonymous. And the question is, what do you think about the 1,000-year reign?
So, the 1,000-year reign is one of those things, it's actually one of the few things in Christianity that can have multiple opinions on it, because it's not what we call an essential doctrine. There are many different views on the 1,000-year reign or the millennial reign, but I was not asked about those particular things. So I'll just stick to what the question is, which is what is my opinion on the 1,000-year reign, which is you have to understand the timeline for end time events. First you'll have, of course, the Great Tribulation. Then after the Great Tribulation, you have this time of the 1,000-year reign, the millennial reign, and then afterwards you will have the eternal age. And so in this 1,000-year reign, it's recorded in Revelation chapter 20, and it talks about a time period where Christ himself will rule and reign on the earth. And so, like I said, there are many views on when that is and what that looks like, or even if it's real. But I think the language there in Revelation is pretty strong as something that should be taken as literal and not figurative. There's certainly many things in the book of Revelation that should just be maybe considered as symbolic or spiritual, and I don't think the 1,000-year reign is one of those. It's described as a wonderful time. There's several passages in Scripture that are kind of attributed to it. One in particular comes from the book of Isaiah, chapter 65, and it says things like people who will die at 100 years old, Isaiah tells us, will be considered as children, and you'll be considered a sinner if you died at 100 years old. Now, if that's true, then if we're correctly using this passage, then that tells us actually quite a bit about the 1,000-year reign. It tells us that it's not going to be a time period that's sinless. It tells us that people, obviously, if it's not sinless, then that means that there are going to be lost people who survive Armageddon. Because if you survive Armageddon and you're a saved person, if you're given a glorified body, and you will be above sin. So people who are raptured, for example, will not be able to sin during the 1,000-year reign. You'll have a glorified body like Christ. And so if there are people that are sinning, then that means that there are people who are not saved. There are people who are not part of the body. These are people that would have survived the Armageddon. And of course, there'll be people who have children during this time period. They'll populate the earth. And you will have people sinning during that time period, and you'll have people dying during that time period. So it's by no means what we call perfect. It's kicked off by the incarceration of Satan. Satan is cast into the bottomless pit for 1,000 years, and that's what kind of begins this reign. And I think that it actually has a potent theological point that God is trying to make during the 1,000-year reign, which is to say that in the Garden of Eden, it was Satan who tempted Adam and Eve to first sin, and of course caused the problem that we're in right now. And so when we stop and ask it, sometimes people who don't believe in a literal 1,000-year reign will sometimes say, what is the point? Well, I think the point is this, that God is going to make the point that even without Satan there to tempt us, in the best possible circumstances, men will still rebel against God, and people will still choose sin over choosing God. Jesus will literally reign on the earth during that time as king. Throughout the Psalms, there are scholars who argue that the point of the book of Psalms is to present the concept of an ideal king. An ideal king we understand being, of course, Jesus. And if it's Jesus, then that means these concepts, this idea in the Psalms of an ideal king is eschatological. It's something that's going to happen in the end times. It's something that's not happened yet. It at least did not happen during the time that the psalmist wrote it. And so if there is going to be this ideal king, this perfect king, and we know he's Jesus, of course, we know Jesus didn't do that during his reign. In his time on earth, rather. He didn't come as a king. He came as a servant. He came humbled, and he was humiliated and died on a cross. And so he was by no stretch of the imagination a king in his time on the earth. So we know that he's going to return. So when is this time period of the ideal king? Well, then it will be this 1,000-year reign. So there's another answer for why it has to happen. These things where these statements about Jesus ruling from Israel and all those things, these are going to be fulfilled during the 1,000-year reign. So you need this time period for those things to come true, and that's given to us in 1,000 years. Another third point that I would make about the 1,000-year reign is that God made multiple promises to the people of Israel about the land that they would own and the way that they would live and all those things. And those things never come true in the Old Testament. Now, they don't come true because of Israel's sin. They never fully possessed the land in the way that driving out their enemies in the way that God commanded them to and promised them that they would. So the fact that Israel failed to keep their end of the bargain does not negate the fact that God made a promise. So if God made a promise, that has to come true sometime. And so that will come true, I believe, during the 1,000-year reign. Well, God will fulfill the promises that he made to Israel, and he will give them the land that he promised them they would have, and so on and so on. And so there are a couple of prophecies then that have to come true, and I think there's a large theological point that has to be made. And I think that's what the millennial reign is all about.
All right. Well, thank you. I hope that satisfies our inquisitors, and I just want everyone to know that you can submit questions, any questions. I've got an extra question. Pastor David, what is your favorite color?
Teal.
It's a good color. Yeah. All right.
I can't believe you wore the same shirt.